Now, I have a keen interest in the European Union and in particular the accession process of Albania and other countries in the region. As we approach the summer break, I wanted to get a rundown of what has happened in the last few months, sort of from last autumn until now, and what is going to happen in the rest of the year. I wanted to find out more about this in general, what to expect. So I decided to invite back to the show again Odeta Barbullushi. Now, she was previously a Sherpa to Prime Minister Edi Rama and an advisor on regional affairs and EU integration. She is now a professor at the College of Europe at its newly established campus in Tirana. Odeta, welcome to Inside Albania for the second time.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Always a pleasure.
Now, I wanted to catch up with you before the end of the season, before everybody takes a summer break, to understand a bit about what has happened in terms of progress regarding EU accession over the last few months, and also, importantly, what lies ahead before the end of the year. Let's start with the growth plan for the Western Balkans, which was announced in Tirana in autumn 2023. Now, for those who don't know, it's designed to help the region's countries into the EU accession process. In a way, it gives some level of preparation and a very large cash injection as well. But what has happened since last autumn with regards to this plan, and what will happen before the end of the year in terms of the growth plan?
That's a very good way to capture that, as you described it. In fact, this month and this week, it's exactly 1 year since the discussion started on how the growth plan would look and on programming of the growth plan. It was a meeting of leaders of the Western Balkans with the Commission on EU Enlargement, Mr. Varhelyi, and with the General Director for the Western Balkans in Tirana, on a possible response to this need of the region to accelerate on socio-economic reforms, and also of what we have, the countries of the region have raised continuously, that the region lags behind economically, socially, and there would be another almost 3 decades ahead for the region, so that it can actually approximate or bridge its socio-economic gap, or what we call a divergence or convergence gap, with the rest of Europe, with the EU. And this is something that Albania, also other countries have raised continuously, that no matter how fast we continue in our EU accession path, if we continue business as usual with regard to the support, the funding that the EU has dedicated to the Western Balkans through what is called these pre-accession funds, the IPA scheme, very little progress will be made with regard to the bridging of the socio-economic gap. So the discussion last summer was indeed focused on this response that the EU came up with. And in November last year, as we know, the President of the European Commission launched the growth and the reform and growth, the growth plan, consisting of 4 dimensions. And I think we have discussed this in my first visit at your studio. We discussed the first dimension consisting of the region phasing in gradually to the single market, to the sectoral areas of the single market. The second dimension being the deepening of regional cooperation and the implementation, more specifically, the implementation of common regional market among 6 countries of the region. The third dimension would be the reform agendas of the countries of the region, and the fourth, the additional funding of the EU for the Western Balkans. When we discuss the growth plan, we primarily tend to focus on the last 2 dimensions, which is the additional funding that the EU is prepared to give, the money for the region, and to the reform agendas. Now, what is new, and I think one cannot overemphasize the bureaucratic novelty or the innovation that this instrument brought, is the linkage between the dimension of reforms and the dimension of the additional funding. So we have an additional conditionality, let's say, which for the countries of the Western Balkans, for the governments, but also for the entire societies, including here the business community, it means that you have to follow up through reform agenda to implement the reforms that the countries themselves have identified as key reforms, so that you can have access to the additional funding. As you know, the growth plan, or the additional funding, consists of around 6 billion euros, which is divided in 2 billion in grants, and which was indeed anticipated as part of the revised multi-annual financial planning of the EU, and 4 other billion which will be given in the form of very soft loan with favorable conditions for the countries of the Western Balkans. Now, when I mention the conditionality element, I think that's the important, or the crux of the matter here, because the countries were invited last year in autumn to start preparing individual reform agendas, which would be primarily focused on the improvement, or aiming at improving, the business climate, and very much overlap and build on the individual economic reform programs of our countries, including here good economic governance and so on, and the rule of law reforms, which are very much, or in fact are at the very heart of our accession process, and what we negotiate, particularly the fundamentals, Chapter 23 and Chapter 24. So for the past over 9 months, Albania and other countries of the Western Balkans have been preparing this list of individual reforms. And each country have sort of identified their own priorities of what they would put forward as part of these as part of reform agendas. In the case of Albania, the areas which have been put forward have been the rule of law, which is horizontal and is cross-country for all 6 countries, but also the pillar of reforms in the area of human capital, with the aim of strengthening human capital, preparing human capital, so that our society becomes part of the European Union, not only through a very sort of narrow prism of market reforms, but also that we build that competitiveness, we build competence among the young people, but also among the businesses, among different professional groups, so that we gradually prepare for EU accession. Another pillar is energy. Energy efficiency, renewable energy, the better integration of our market to the EU energy market, and so on. Is the green transition also that is inbuilt in that as part of that pillar? Digitalization and improvement of digital skills, of digital connectivity, and so on. And the last pillar, which is also cross-country, including the other 5 countries of the Western Balkans, the improvement of business, of the environment for business, which that also includes improvement of governance, improvement of the legal framework, so that there will be also more trust on the side of investors, of foreign investors, to invest in Albania and in the region. Improvement of transparency when it comes to cadastres, when it comes to all the systems which sort of enhance that trust on the part of investors to come to our country and to the region as a whole, and so on. So these are the 5 sort of thematic pillars where we have identified key reforms. Different reforms have been identified by the countries, by the other 5 countries, but there are, like I mentioned, very strong similarities, particularly when it comes to the rule of law reforms, when it comes to human capital, where also, let's say, Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo have chosen human capital as one of the key priority pillars, or in the business climate sector. Now, what I think it was very positive in this process was the countries were invited to prepare or to identify these reforms. But the process in itself was a process of negotiations. Like, we submitted the first draft, and then the European Commission came back to us with their comments and suggestions, and we had to go through institutional coordination to see how we could respond to the suggestions of the Commission, but also identify and set very clear sort of time frame, very clear deadlines, and very clear indicators. When we mean to improve the business climate, it means what? When we mean when we indicate that we would, or anticipate we would improve the system of transparency of cadastre and so on, that means what? Or let's say in the human capital, one of the objectives we have identified is improvement of the system on vocational education. What that means in terms of the system, what it means in terms of curricula, what it means also in terms of the actual numbers of students that would be able to attract, and the actual number of students who would be immediately employed in the market. And we're talking about a general framework, a time frame, of from 2024 to 2027. So it's quite limited and it's quite focused. In this process of negotiation now, or as a result of this, Albania, but also other countries have now come to a consolidated list of reforms.
So they're finalized?
It's almost final. It's being finalized internally. And I think the next step would be that once the new commission is in place, is in office, we'll have its approval in early autumn. It has to go through the Commission, will have to submit it to the Council, to present it to the Council. Through this, also the regulation of implementation of the growth plan, and that will be approved by the Council, which means by all countries of the EU. Another, I think, what is in terms of the new elements that this growth plan brings, if I may, is that of the money which is allocated, or let's say the financial pot which is allocated to each country, let's say for Albania is around 1 billion, half of that will be budget support. Will go through the ministries of finance for each country, based on agreements, on bilateral agreements. The other half will go for investments in infrastructure, transport, energy, and so on. It will go through the mechanism of Western Balkan Investment Facility Fund, Western Balkan WBIF, what we call in our slang of EU expertise, yes. But what is, I think, new and is quite an incentive is that the countries do not compete with each other at the start moment. They do not compete with their projects in terms of whether this project is better than a project from Serbia or is better than a project from North Macedonia. That money is given to each country, but conditioned upon your own reforms, upon the implementation of the reforms you have identified
and
in your
KPIs
individual
you've set for accountability.
Exactly. So that, I think, is an element which adds additional conditionality, but also which adds an incentive to each. For each country, to each country of the region. A country
can't turn around and say, well, this is unfair, this is unattainable.
Exactly. So it's not quite comparable to other countries. Why is this given this project on energy to the other countries? No, this is the money which is allocated to each, but upon the condition that you implement the reform agenda that you have put forward.
So from autumn, exactly 1 year since it was sort of formally announced in Tirana, we could start to see this sort of completely finalised and things start moving. And you mentioned the new commission being in place. Obviously, things are still going on. Do we expect any impact on the accession process, on this plan, on anything to do with Albania joining the EU from the changes in the commission regarding the committees, regarding those in the council, regarding even Ursula von der Leyen, etc.? This is still not completely signed and sealed at the moment. Do you expect any changes because of this?
I don't really expect major changes or changes that would impact the process, in fact, because in a way the bureaucratic machine, which has been, let's say, at the very center of this process, is still there. So that process hasn't been halted. It will take some time with the new commissioners to come in the office and so on, but the expertise and know-how is there. And I think it was very helpful that a lot of work, or the bulk of the work, has been done in the past year, so that now it's a process ongoing. Now we start the real the serious steps of disbursement. So that is what once the facility, the regulation, is because the facility was approved earlier this year. But I'm talking about the regulation of implementation by the Council. That should start. So I don't think there will be any changes which will impact this process. Like I said, the bureaucratic machine is in place. The DG will be the same, but also very likely we'll have the new president of the Commission in place, and she was very much the initiator of this response for the Western Balkans. So I do not anticipate much change in that.
The machine is already moving, and the various changes in these positions are not likely to impact it.
Basically. No, I don't think so.
Good. That's a relief, because it's taken a long time to get here. You know,
exactly.
There has been this feeling of stagnation in the region, in Albania as well. And I think this growth plan is a way of showing people that there is progress still happening. Okay, we haven't joined the EU yet. We haven't opened negotiations properly, but things are going on behind the scenes.
And if I may add, Alice, it's also, I think, with this instrument, what we see is also a new approach on the part of the EU, because we see for the first time this idea of an accelerated or gradual phasing into the single market, which is the first dimension of the growth plan. Indeed, as I said, the attention tends to go and the focus tends to go on additional money and the reforms, because these reforms will need to be carried out by us, by the governments of the country, by societies and so on, by the administration and so on, by all actors. But it's also the first dimension, which is the possibility that you phase it into a single market. Yes. If you remember the past 3 summits that have been organized this year in the region, in Skopje, in Tirana, in Kotor, they have focused on common or joint efforts on the part of the region to come up with ideas that would accelerate these countries' integration into single market or into, let's say, common economic areas of the EU. And some of the ideas I'm sure you've heard of, like, let's say, the accession of our countries into the single agreement, single European payment agreement, which would make it much easier, but also much cheaper, the process of, let's say, of transfer of remittances from our diaspora to Albania and so on. And these are very concrete costs that translate into actual costs or less costs for the people.
And also it's less of a shock as well. You know, you're not saying to countries, you have to get everything completely ready and then bam, suddenly, you know, you're stepping into this new world. You know, it's done gradually. They're given the help that they need to reach it. And then it's not such a shock, you know, at the end of the process. And I wanted to ask as well, we've talked about, I mean, you mentioned SEPA there, that's a good example, but what other tangible differences is this plan going to make to people's life? You know, we can sit and talk about reform and dangling carrots in the form of funding, etc. But for the average person on the street or watching this, you know, how are their lives going to change from certain areas of reform?
Well, and going back to the example of SEPA, because that is maybe more concrete and simple to understand, looking at numbers of how, you know, this sort of membership would reduce the cost, like, let's say, from 6.7% of the remittances that would be spent on the fees, if we reduce that fee to 3%, the number, let's say the benefit or the reduction of the cost would be something like 30 million, which is unimaginable. It's a lot of money, and that translates into tangible benefits. Or also the other initiative that we discussed in the same context of initiatives that would help us phase in gradually into the common economic areas, like, let's say, this Wi-Fi for the Western Balkans, which was indeed a commitment of the Berlin process of the 6 countries in the context of the Tirana summit of leaders of Berlin process, and which was followed up or extended onto the discussion of the growth plan. That is also another 15 million that will be given in the form of vouchers to the Albanian municipalities to cover all areas of their municipalities with the Wi-Fi and so on. So there are a number, let's say, of benefits. The way I would see the tangible benefits are through, let's say, in 3 ways. One is these projects. They have very tangible, concrete benefit. They translate into actual money or reduction of fees. The second is related to good governance. So if we are talking about, let's say, transparency of cadastral system, transparency of rules and procedures, digitalization, that means less informality, that means less corruption. And that translates in a very tangible ways into less money spent on the system. It's not something that can be very easily sort of, let's say, counted, but it is less less cost for the people for very simple services.
Easier for citizens as well to access things if they are digitalized, if the things work properly, if they're not being sucked into corruption somewhere along the way.
Exactly.
Very noticeable improvement.
And the third way I would see it is through the investment. So this is, we call it the reform, the growth and reform agenda. And the growth component includes the improvement of chances, enhancement of chances for investment. Once you improve some of the parameters in good governance, and that is across not only rule of law, but also reforms of rule of law, which have a spilling effect on all other components, that translates, I think, in better environment for investment in all 6 countries of the Western Balkans. So the way I would see it is from most tangible to sort of broader benefits, which are more structural and systemic. One component which I mentioned with regard to growth plans, it's in a way, it's very technical, very tangible way of putting down deadlines and timeframes, very focused timeframes, and very very concrete calculations of how disbursement will be made on the basis of implementation of the percentages of reforms. This is something new. And that, I think, gives a new sense of predictability, not only to public administration, but also to the people. So this needs to be done, let's say, by 2025. To what extent this will be done and implemented will have a direct bearing on the money that can be accessible for the countries.
But also it becomes more tangible for people if they can see, okay, the government has said they're going to do this, and this by this date. Have they done it? Yes, no, yes, no. And that's another way. Will people be able to follow this progress, these milestones? Is there somewhere that they can see, what's been achieved, what needs to be achieved, etc.?
As far as I know, different rounds of consultation have been made in different countries, some with public administration. Of course, the entire public administration has been part of this exercise because it's a very comprehensive and horizontal exercise of preparing these reform agendas, but also business community, companies, the private sector. A gradual civil society has come on board into the process. Some organizations or some segments of civil society, through their engagement in burden process, have been sort of more familiarized with the process and of preparing the growth plan and asking more questions, and I think that's very healthy. But because of the very focused and short time frame, we just mentioned it was 1 year. Within 1 year, everything happened. There hasn't been what we have seen in the past, these lengthy consultation processes, because of the focus and very sort of short time frame of the process in itself. But this, I think, will continue. And like you said, the very nature of this instrument will raise expectations, will also give more leverage to civil society, social groups, different actors, universities and so on, and experts to actually be able to ask questions and exert more pressure.
And before the end of the year, is there any sort of key moments that people should be waiting for? Are there going to be any more summits or conferences? Are there any reports we can expect? Are there any further developments?
Well, we are very much hoping for the opening of the political IGC, and we very much hope this will be within this year, within this autumn, in fact.
So I explain, that's the official start of the official opening of the chapters of negotiation.
Of the chapters, yes. We have exactly 2 years ago, in 10 days, I think we'll have the second anniversary of opening officially the accession process. But now we're talking about the first cluster. And all the conditions on our side have been ready for some time now. We'll need, of course, the decision of the Council, which means all countries, for the opening of the first cluster. cluster, and we very much hope this will happen within this year. I understand you also interviewed very recently the head of the EU delegation in Tirana, so they might know something better, something more about this than I do.
No, I'm nothing, the same thing, we hope that it's going to happen, but obviously the decision ultimately lies with the members of the council. But is there any concern from Albania's side about this decision? I mean, we have Hungary leading the council at the moment. Is there any sort of concern, or are the government sort of optimistic about it?
We'll need to see the priorities of the new commission. You rightly mentioned now we have the new commission coming in. We'll see the priorities. It's very important that EU integration, that accession enlargement remains there in that list of priorities of the new commission. For us, it's very important. And also it's important that the Hungarian presidency has indeed put enlargement of the Western Balkans as one of the priorities of their presidency. So I think politically there we are on there is nothing to fear or to concern. I think it's a matter of unanimous decision of the members of the countries, members of the council to give the green light for the IGC.
And just the first cluster that will be opened, which cluster is this?
That is the fundamentals. That is primarily chapter 23-24, with some new elements which, let's say, concern public procurement, financial governance, and so on. And in fact, that is the heart of the process, because that, in a way, these are the chapters which cover the key reforms in the area of rule of law, in the area of economic reform programs, and are very much the reforms upon which the entire process will be conditioned. And these are the chapters which will only close at the end of the process. So it's not what we have seen, let's say, with previous enlargements, but also with countries which have opened negotiations before us, like Montenegro, let's say, that have opened the accession negotiation with a chapter on research and on research, not on rule of law, as has become fundamentals, as has become the case for Albania. And that, of course, reflects or is a response of the process in itself, what we have seen in the region, that it didn't mean much in terms of implementation of reforms or the quality of democracy just because you had opened most of the chapters or have progressed most in this process. When you had backsliding in the fundamentals, we've had a very positive report on the screening process for these chapters, and the only next
so the
step
screening
now
is where the Albanian authorities, government looks at what is expected, what's in the EU acquis,
and what's in our legislation
what we have in Albania, and goes, okay, well, this needs to be changed, that's okay, etc.
Exactly.
Okay.
What needs to be added, what needs to be improved. Yes. Okay. If there is a new roadmap on, let's say, public administration on a specific measure, then yes. And then you report back. So I think, and this is what makes the process very challenging. It's not something that you can negotiate as much as you actually adopt to what the EU asks you to do.
Yes, it's not such a negotiation sort of process. These are quite firm.
You adopt and transform.
So hopefully by the end of the year, we hope to have some good news regarding this.
Very much so, but I think in parallel, it's very important the discussion we were having about this new instrument of additional funding, which we have been, Albania, but also other countries in the region have been quite enthusiastic about, because we've seen that an instrument of economic and social transformation. So it's important of what you said. As we wait for the next IGC to open, as we wait for the next steps, it's important that we continue the Europeanization at every level of our societies, of our economies, of our political systems, and so on. And we continue with the reforms in the judiciary, in all other key reforms that are fundamental to the process in the end. So, again, going back to the growth plan, what's important here is that we're talking about a new qualitative phase, a very different stage of and quality of relations between the EU and the region. So the idea is that we become ready, as you said. We are more competitive. We are more resilient, that we are more prepared, so that when the moment of membership comes, there is no surprise, and we are there with our homework done. Yes.
No panic. Yes. So yeah, I mean, in conclusion, what I'm hearing is that even if the formal negotiation, the chapters are not opened by the end of this year, it doesn't mean that Albania's progress has stopped. There is still this other pathway which is continuing, which is progressing, which is going on, which will aid Albania in the accession process.
Yes.
So even if it's not good news by the end of the year, progress is still being made, and Albania is continuing on its path.
This is very important.
Yes.
This is a complementary path, not another alternative path, but this is a very complementary path to what we are doing in our bilateral accession process with the EU.
Odetta, thank you very much.
Thank you for your invitation.